Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. I think we're live, so my name's Nicki, and if you watched my last stream you'll realise I'm twice as long as I said I was going to be before starting this one, so apologies for that. Unfortunately I've just had to sit on my washing machine waiting. For some reason it got stuck on the spin cycle forever, not that you care, but that's why, and I've just been outside hanging up that last little bit, so that's why my glasses are a little bit dark, but they should change back as we progress through the stream. So let me get rid of this banner. We are here for the end of the month reading wrap up, of course. And if you watched my last stream, you'll know that I've had my second Pfizer this week and I'm feeling a little bit iffy and just exhausted and that still. So I am just doing this again through my computer built-in cam and mic rather than pulling out all the stuff and setting it up, because I just can't be faced with that today, so sorry about that. But I just wanted to make sure I did the stream and got it out on time and everything. So we will whiz through. I've got about 14 books I read this month, so starting us off, a couple that I actually received for I can't remember if it was birthday or Christmas, but one of the two in December last year. And I still needed to get around to reading them. So since Christmas and birthday presents are nearly upon us again, I thought I should try to clear some of the oldest ones on my shelf before as always, I get a new influx of books for the holidays. So kicking us off, I read Balzac's Harlot, High and Low. So this is about my third or fourth book by Balzac. I have to say this is not my favourite one. I only gave it 3 stars. It's a bit of a mixed bag for me, really. I liked the characters. One of the main characters was a previous book I read, which I really enjoyed. But this one, the story, it started off okay, but as it progressed, I just lost interest in the characters. There was just too much going on, I think, at times. And it just became a bit long-winded. So not the book I'd recommend if you're new to his writing, but I'm just trying to work my way gradually through all his stuff. So this was just a bit of a middling one for me. Next up, I read Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. And in some ways similar to the one I just mentioned, this was not my favourite ever Gaskell book. It still got 4 stars from me. This is actually her first ever novel. And you can kind of see how her style matured by the time she wrote, say, like North and South. But it still was an enjoyable book, a little bit melodramatic, but still enjoyable. Moving on then, so I've got to flick through a few pages, I think, because then there's all stuff I had read. Yes, here we go. So next up is The Ruin of I can't even speak today. The Ruin of Kings by Jenn Lyons. Now, this book I received, I've written an arc, I think, in the description, but obviously it's not an arc per se, because it's been out for a little while now. The story behind this was that I received, just out of the blue, a book for review from Pan Macmillan, Australia, and I hadn't requested it, and the reason I hadn't requested it off their list was because it's the 4th book in a series and I hadn't read the first 3 books. So when they sent me this book on spec, I emailed them and said, look, thank you so much, but I haven't read all the rest of the story. So they very kindly offered to send me the first 3 books in the series with no sort of time restraints on when I needed to read them by. So I was really happy about that because the story did look interesting. And so I have actually the first 4 books in the series. I think the final 5th book is coming out next year. So my aim is to try and read all of these before the end of the year, or at least by January, but we'll see how I go, because they are quite hefty books, 700, 800 odd pages each. So the first book in the series, though, was The Ruin of Kings. So this is an epic fantasy series in which the main character is not the hero. He's actually supposedly going to be destined to destroy the world. So it was a really interesting piece. I liked the way it was told in this dual narration with both the main character and his captor at the time, telling different parts of the story, going back and forth in time. And I think that actually worked really well. It gave you a chance to see, you kind of knew where he was at present, so we were seeing just the last little bit that led to that, plus also going back in time to see really where it had all begun. So it was a gripping idea. There's a lot going on, and I was grateful for the kind of genealogy chart and house descriptions and stuff in the back that I could flick back and forth and refer to if I just needed to check who was related to whom and things like that. So that was really helpful. And the story definitely kept me interested and captivated from start to finish. And I've paused. I haven't gone straight onto book 2 because I have a few books I need to read with a deadline. So I'm reading those first, but then I will be back hopefully during November for the next book. And I gave The Runic Kings 4.5 stars. So moving on, I read a few books. The next few will all be from NetGalley, the next 4. So first up was The Battle of the Linguist Mages by Scotto. So this book is almost a cyberpunk kind of thing, I guess. The premise was really interesting. It was the idea that there's this woman who's top of the league board in this video game she plays, but then things happen where the sort of real world and the computer world start to bleed into each other. That was all fascinating, and I really loved the first half. However, I gave this book, what did I give it in the end? 3.5 stars? Yes, 3.5 stars. Because I felt in the second half it began to get just too complicated for its own good. So many things were trying to be thrown around, and not all the time was I completely sure I understood the logic behind what was happening and things. And I think it's just too much. I think if it had just stuck with that initial concept without branching off too far into other things, it would have worked better. But it was certainly really fascinating. Language plays an important role, as you might guess from the title, in this book, which as a keen language learner and linguist myself, I found really fascinating and enjoyable, and that was a great aspect of it for me. So check it out if you just want something quirky and really different, but I just think it kind of tripped over itself a little bit in the end. Sticking with the idea of language, I read a non-fiction book called The Language Game by Christiansen and Charter, and this was a 4-star read for me. So this was looking at kind of the idea of how do we acquire languages, both first languages and second languages. And as I said, as a keen linguist and language learner myself, this was a really fascinating topic. I'm not sure if I agreed 100% with all the ideas they put forward, but they were certainly interesting and well expressed and gave you plenty to think about. So if you're interested in languages and language learning, it's worth checking out. Next up, I read The Darkest Vampire by Juliana Heygert. This was a 3.5-star read for me. It's a paranormal romance, as you might expect from the title, and it was a pretty standard paranormal romance. There were things I liked about it. There were some bits that I wasn't quite so keen on. The basic premise of this one is you have this young woman who, she's a witch, but she doesn't really have a lot of power, and she's gotten caught up in something that she's trying to get out of, and in the process she ends up freeing from this magical box a vampire. And so the story behind who he is and why he was imprisoned is obviously an important part of the plot, and their growing relationship, because it is a paranormal romance. Their relationship was one of the bits that I didn't think worked quite so well for me. It just felt a little bit sudden. I just would have liked to have seen it develop a bit slower, I think. And then I read A Land of Never After by R.L. Daniva, and this is another Peter Pan retelling. There's been quite a slew of Peter Pan retellings in recent times, and some of them have worked really well and I've enjoyed, but unfortunately this was not one of them. This was a 2.5-star read for me. I kind of could see what the author wanted to achieve with it, but it just didn't work for me. And I think perhaps the problem was calling it a retelling, because although it was clearly inspired by Peter Pan, it was not a retelling in the traditional sense, in that for the most part, the key story elements of Peter Pan were not all present. So I think maybe a bit of misadvertising is perhaps to blame for this book, my feelings about this book, because it just was not what I was expecting from what I was told from the blurb, and the fact that it was very clearly named a Peter Pan retelling, whereas I think it was more just a story inspired by Peter Pan. And perhaps if you approach it from that angle, you'll like it more. But it brought up a few interesting ideas about Wendy's relationship with Captain Hook in particular. I thought was interesting when it was introduced, and I just would have liked to have seen that explored a bit more. And Wendy was really the only character we got to know. Like, even Peter was just a bit of a two-dimensional shadowy figure. So for me, that was just a little bit of a letdown, and perhaps some people out there will really love it, but it just wasn't quite what I'd wanted it to be, if you see what I mean, from what the blurb had suggested. So just going back to arcs, I got Scary Monsters from Michelle de Kretser from Allen and Unwin, and I won this in a giveaway. This is a 4-star read for me. This is an interesting book, contemporary, I guess a hint of fantasy or sci-fi in a way, but essentially a contemporary piece looking at some pretty big themes, sort of racism and sexism and all that kind of stuff. All the big hard-hitting themes are covered in this book. It was interesting. It's a two-story book in some ways, and they'd done this by having one story, one half of the book, and then you had to kind of flip the book to read the other story. So they kind of went cover to meet in the middle, each of them. And one of the stories I really loved, the piece set in the sort of recent past. The piece set in the near future, I wasn't quite as keen on. It felt a little bit too preachy to me. And whenever you introduce themes, of course, you're going to introduce a viewpoint with them, and that's fine, and that's great. I like to have something to think about in some of the books I read, but I don't like it when that turns into feeling like I'm being preached at and being told what I ought to think. And I kind of felt that way a bit about that the story set in the future, which I didn't in the other story. So that's why for me it got 4 stars. I think it was a very interesting piece, a very well written piece, but it was just that tone that just didn't quite sit right with me. Going back to NetGalley for the next 4. First of all, I read the illustrated Etymologicon, if I can say it. It's one of those days, I'm afraid, by Mark Forsyth. This was a 5-star read for me. So this book is basically looking at the origins of words. And the author kind of takes us through this journey, moving from one word to the next, almost like a sort of stream of consciousness, that one thing makes him think of something else. It has plenty of fun illustrations and bits along the way too. And if you're interested in language, the English language, where words come from, then you definitely want to check out this book. And it is a very nicely presented book too, so it's a great little coffee table read you could just pick up and flick through. Next up, I read The Ultimate Baking for One by Kelly Jaggers. And this was a 4-star read for me. I really liked the idea of this because I find that, for me, it's just my husband and I at home. And there are times when we think, oh, we'd like to bake something, like to make something, but unless we've got an opportunity to give some out to friends and family, we usually just end up eating it all ourselves. And then we feel really guilty and bad because we both want to try and lose weight, not put it on. And the trouble is, when you cook up a big batch of something, you don't want it to go to waste. So I think this book was a really great idea. And the recipes, although it says baking for one, many of the recipes kind of made between 2 to 6 portions of things. So you could say it's for one person, or you could easily have it for 2 people. So there were some nice recipes that I thought, oh yeah, that's something that you could try out. The only thing that made me give this a 4 and not a 5 is that some of them were huge amounts of ingredients. Not in terms of the amount of the ingredients, but in terms of the number of ingredients needed for the recipe. And some of them took ages as well, you know, an hour in the oven here and an hour like resting there and things like that. And I just thought, if it's a book for something to cook for one, I wouldn't put that much. I'd put that much effort in if I was baking a huge batch to take for Christmas or something. But I wouldn't want to have to buy that many ingredients and put that much time into it just to make 2 portions of something that will be gone in 2 minutes. So that side of things, I just felt that maybe they could have balanced the recipes a bit with some that were like really quick and simple, like 3 or 4 ingredients, half an hour max, that would have worked well as well if you're just doing it for one person. Because I just wouldn't put an hour's effort into something just for me, is the basic like gist of it. I mean, maybe that's just me. Maybe other people, perhaps they sort of love the process and they'd be happy to do that. But I just wish there'd been a bit of a mix of some quick and simple recipes as well. But the idea of having a book with the exact proportion of ingredients needed just for a small batch, just so you didn't waste any or you didn't end up overeating, I think that was a great idea. The next book I read was Guillermo de Toro by Ian Nathan. So this is kind of an overview of the life and works of Guillermo del Toro with a focus on the works. It does talk a little bit about his personal life and background, but essentially the focus is taking us through his history as a filmmaker. This was a 4.5-star read for me. I found it really enjoyable. The only thing I wanted was for it to be a bit longer and there to be a little bit more detail here and there, particularly maybe on his use of motifs and themes in his films, which I find really fascinating, and I think that's a great part of his filmmaking. But if you're a fan of Guillermo del Toro's movies, this was a really nice biography that you might want to check out. The next book I read was Monkey. So this is, I think the full title is Monkey, New Stories from Japan, Volume 2, Travel. Various authors involved in this, including big names like Haruki Murakami. So it's a collection of stories, and as well as stories, there was a no play, there was some poetry in there, there was a graphics, like little graphic story. I gave this 4 stars. It was a nice collection. There were some pieces I particularly liked. The opening piece, a sort of fantasy story, was great. I liked the little graphic story about the coat, and some of the poetry in the no play were really interesting as well. One thing I particularly liked about this book was at the back, each of the translators of the pieces talked about a particular word that they'd had trouble with, which again, as a keen language learner and the fact I'm learning Japanese, I was interested to see which words they'd picked out and said that, you know, they had difficulty translating this from the Japanese and why. So that was a really nice addition, I thought. But definitely, if you're a fan of contemporary Japanese writing, there's plenty of material in here, and as I said, some of it from big name contemporary authors. We've only got 2 more books to go. First of all, the final NetGalley one for the month was London Explored by Dazeley and Daly. And this was a 4-star read for me. So this is a kind of photographic guidebook, I guess you'd say, and some beautiful images, as you would expect from a book like that. And interestingly, I've been reading some of these London guides because I lived, while I was in England, till my mid-20s, I lived about a 45-minute train journey outside of London. So I went there quite often. I did a lot of sightseeing, and since I've been back with my husband, we've done more. And when I used to meet pen pals who were visiting England there, I used to do some with them. So I've always felt like I've done a good chunk of London's tourist attractions, if you like. And so I find these books interesting when they offer a glimpse of some quirky places that I perhaps haven't come across. And I definitely did add about another 3 things to my next time I'm in London list from this book, just places I hadn't heard of before but looked really interesting. So the book is very photo heavy, as you might expect, but it does contain text explaining about the places as well, and then a few details on where they're located so you could go there. So yeah, if you're interested in visiting London and perhaps have done all the big name tourist sites, then these books are particularly, there's a whole series of them, and they're worth checking out for some quirky and different ideas of what to go and see. Which brings us to the last book of the month, which I literally finished last night. I haven't even written up my blog review yet. I'm going to be doing that next after I finish this video. And it is A Marvellous Light by Freya and Marske. And this I received as an ARC from Pan Macmillan, Australia. And it was a 5-star read for me. So this is a gay fantasy murder mystery story. So if that rocks your boat, then you're certain to love this. It's set in the Edwardian era, so it's historical as well. Just to add another note to that sort of entry or intro. We have two characters. We have a young man called Robin, who's just been appointed to this government post, and upon arriving there, he discovers that he's now in charge of being a liaison about between the government and the magicians who live in the city. One of those magicians is his sort of counterpart, and they don't get off to a great start, but that's partly because this young man, Robin's predecessor, has disappeared and no one quite knows what's happened to him. So that sort of sets off the mystery element, and we discover that there's a bit of a conspiracy, a magical conspiracy going on. And it is a gay romance as well, so that eventually the two characters do come together in a romantic manner. There is plenty of kissing, there's sex scenes in it, so just bear that in mind if that's your sort of thing or not. But it was a really great story. I thought the writing was good, I liked the plot, the characters came across well, their relationship developed at a reasonable and believable pace, and the book ended in a way that's left me really interested to see what will happen next, because this is the first book in a trilogy. So I certainly hope that the next book, I guess, might come out next year sometime, and I'd definitely like to read it. So I will end there for now. I'll be back again at the end of November with another of these streams, and prior to that I have a couple of scheduled videos, of course, coming out for you, plus my mid-month language learning one as well. So do come back for those. I will close there for now, but I look forward to seeing all of you again very soon. Bye for now, everyone.